I think that's what's happening. Anyway, good morning. Glad to have you all with us today. We are going to be discussing chapter 20, which moves us into the end of the 18th, early part of the 19th century, and then tries to move us all the way toward the end of the 19th century, about 1860s and 70s. Good morning to all of you. We're going to be looking at some of the details there. Just a reminder, some of you have already taken the exam over chapters that we just completed through chapter 19, 15 through 19. Some of you have already taken it. It's still available. It's going to stay open through Wednesday. I have it set up that way. So if you haven't taken it, you still have that opportunity. If something happens, you can't get into it. It's supposed to allow you to still get into it through Wednesday evening. If something happens, send me an email and we'll see what's going on with it. But some of you have already taken it. If you have, I've actually graded it. As far as I know, I've graded the short answer ones. So it should be reported for you. But you can, again, if you haven't had a chance to take it, it should still be available. Don't worry about if you're taking it, says it's late. That late doesn't work. That doesn't mean anything. So long as it's available, you're fine. So anyway, that's takes care of some of the business. So let's look into chapter 20. One of the major aspects about this chapter, and I'm going to share the screen with you guys. I have for you some key information about the chapter. Starts here. The chapter is a little differently organized. As we go back through some parts, it's actually, you'll go back to the 1700s toward the end of the 18th century, and then moves its way up to eventually the 18, I think 70 is the last day it officially lives. But you'll note that early in the chapter, it's actually talking about some of the other aspects, and Karl Marx and Frederick Engels are talked about early in the chapter, which is why I put them here. In the information, the little notes I give you, I put them at the front because that's where they're discussing the chapter. But they're really going to mid 19th century, 1840s, 1850s, when you're going to see the publication of their great work and Communist Manifesto. You're going to see the influence them pick up from the 1850s and 60s and 70s. And we're going to, so really that's when their influence is. But they're early in the book, in the chapter 20. So I have those for you. One of the famous quotes about workers of the world unite, Civil War. We're going to move into Manet and Monet. And one way you can tell about Manet and Monet, Manet will focus on the background, the landscape, but he'll have people in a prominent position. Monet, his focus is much more on the landscape. This particular one does have people, but they're not really distinguished. You can't really make out too much about them. It's the background, the landscape that really is prominent. So Monet is more landscape. Manet has landscape and people, and then Renoir is more people. So again, he'll have people in his. Degas, if it's typically painting about dancers, it's going to be a Degas. These are impressionist. We also have in this chapter is going to be talking more about British and America writers. So British and American writers are really going to be looked at much more strongly. But we also have other aspects and details that we're going to be looking at. And so that's in the chapter. So when we look at this, of course, this is from the Departure of the Volunteers. It's a recalling that neoclassic style that we were talking about in the previous chapter. This is Rude, as his work here is presented in the Arc de Triomphe. Again, the Arc de Triomphe is done later. It's from Napoleon, much more of that call back to that neoclassic, the Roman, Greco-Roman style that we've talked about before. And so we have these details. They all open this particular chapter with a quote from Tale of Two Cities. It was the best times, worst of times, Dickens, who, of course, is looking back on the era. He's writing much later than the era that the novel is set, but this is what we wind up seeing. And so you have these details that are offered. The La Marseillaise is going to be the national anthem of France, really. But what we wind up with, and this is where it starts, they focus on the political revolutions. Now, if you'll remember, chapter 19 talked about revolutions and really had looked at an age of revolution in that time. Well, this one picks up and extends that. As I mentioned, when we talked about chapter 19, we were going to be coming back to some of the details. The French Revolution of 1789, which we talked about 19, leads to turmoil. Since 1848, you have changes occurring, rebellions taking place. You have a rise of political discord. In England, you have elections taking place where the Parliament shuttles between who's in charge and who's not. As I made a comment, I think for you folks, George III, remember the Hanovers take over with George I in 1714. They're German. George I really doesn't see himself as much more than a German. George II, a little more in touch with England. George III, though, sees himself as an Englishman. And he thinks as English king, he should have the control. Now, for George III, you may remember, he's the one in 1770s, the American situation. Well, George III is trying to take charge in this time up till about 1820. So they're giving you some different years. And so when George IV takes over in 1820, he's a little older. And so he gets replaced fairly soon. And you wind up with this constant moving between, George III dies. He was insane for the last 10 years of his life. So from basically 1810 to 1820, you have what is called the Regency, where his son, Prince George, is sort of the acting monarch, which means really Parliament seizes control. Well, when George IV takes over, he wants to be a little more in charge. And so you have conflicts arising between Parliament and the monarchy. Well, by the time you get to the 50s and 60s, again, the monarchy is trying to assert itself, but Parliament is still in control. So you have quite a bit taking place in England at that time. And then, of course, in the United States, you're having some issues arising. As we start having the political issues arising, the South and the North having a split by 1861. So we're going to be covering quite a bit of revolution politically in this chapter. You have a rise in industry. This is the Industrial Revolution, where you're going to start having populations build and expand rapidly in urban settings. As it says here, Turin becomes a seat of industry in Italy, and its population more than doubles in a period of 50, 60 years. Same happens in the urban settings in the United Kingdom, in France, in other areas of Europe, Germany, for instance, but also in the United States, this is occurring. As it says here, a Londoner described the city in the 20s as a wilderness of human beings. It really starts growing. So urban life becomes really strong. Tale of Two Cities, London and Paris, as Tale of Two Cities focuses upon that. This, of course, is the National Opera House in Paris. Those of you who have ever looked at the book or read the book or seen the movie version of Phantom of the Opera, well, the National Opera House is supposed to be the setting of that. You can see this is very much in that neoclassic style that we've talked about. You can see the Rococo influence. Look at the gilding and the gold. The elaborate details are offered here. So this is what we have in this particular one. In London, you have a building and development there. Railways are in and out, connecting the major urban centers throughout England and all the way up into Scotland. You have even an underground railway, what's called the tube in England. You have it built also in France. You have what's called the underground there. And so you have these are being built. Train travel becomes more common, and since there's mundane and exotic, but it's they're built across Europe, in the Far East, India. You start having the connection of the trains. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about India in the previous week, and in America, of course, we're going to start seeing the development. Shortly after the Civil War, you have the Transcontinental Railroad, where literally from one coast to the other coast, from east to west coast, is being built. This is Baudelaire, one of the major French poets. He's a wonderful poet, has a sort of a darker view, highly influenced by actually an American poet, Edgar Poe. And in 1861, he's looking at his Paris, and he says, look at what has happened. Look at what has occurred. That Paris has been ruined. As it says here, there used to be a poultry market here. And one cold morning, with the sky swept clean, the ground too swept bay, garbage men who raised clouds of soot, saw a swan that had broken out of his cage, web feet clumsy on the cobblestones, white feathers dragging in the uneven ruts, pecking at the drains. It says, in sadness like mine, nothing stirs. New buildings, old neighborhoods turn to allegory. And he sees this idea about this change, because what's going to happen during this time, Haussmann is brought in by the new emperor to redo Paris, to modernize it, to change it up dramatically. And it happens. Meanwhile, as you'll notice here, suddenly we're in the 1860s again. We have the picture here of Lincoln. Says that, the United States, you have the Confederate States, the Civil War taking place, the issues that occurs, the assassination of Lincoln, all this sort of capsulized here in this little comment. Meanwhile, you also have intellectual revolutions taking place, people bringing out, rising out of that enlightenment that we talked about previously in 19, this idea about the enlightenment, looking at the world, saying we can do. Man is capable of great thoughts. Man is able to understand the world around him, the science that has applied to the world, applied to technology, helping to create that sort of positive atmosphere around what's occurring. Well, this is what is also occurring here in this era. The idea that, again, as it says here, that freedom to use one one's intelligence rather than just giving into blind authority, blind acceptance of authority. Now you get to use your own intelligence, not gripped by superstition, not gripped by fear, but rather applying knowledge, science to understand the world around them, employing reason to, as it says here, to better society. And that's a key part of that we see from the Enlightenment. Well, this is extended in this era. What's eventually going to happen is there's going to be a reaction against science. This idea that everything gets sort of codified and studied and put into this individual tray to be dissected. Well, you're going to have another group of people who say, no, we need to get back to feelings. Let's not worry so much about reason. We need to understand it through our feelings. What do we feel about it? To give you an idea of, and that's what is Romanticism. This idea that the science would look at a tree and want to take it apart and say, okay, how does it grow? What contributes to its development? Let's pull a leaf off and figure out why it's green and understand about photosynthesis. The romantic will look at the tree and say, isn't it beautiful? Look how majestic it is with its branches and its leaves, and they would go hug the tree. That's the difference between the neoclassic attitude and what is going to follow it, what we call the romantic attitude. And it's here the idea that man is creative, that we can be emotional, that nature is unspoiled if we will just leave it alone and learn how we should fit into nature, not exploit it. That's Romanticism. You have philosophical movements. Again, notice that we're going back really to the time of what the previous chapter 19, covered. Immanuel Kant is really in this age of reason, in the 18th century. He dies in 1804, and he writes Critique of Judgment in the 1790s. So again, we're sort of moving backwards. Already we've talked about Karl Marx in this book. He's offered early about politics. Well, that's a little bit later. Kant looked at the world and said, okay, what can we know? How do we know it? How do we understand it? It says that the objects in the world are products of our minds, that we extend from our mind to create, that whatever is out there must be filtered through our mind to become meaningful, that we're the ones who ascribe meaning to something, that we impose the order, as it says here, that what we see is how we understand it. It's our perception of something that gives that thing its meaning, its importance. So we judge it in that way. He also did a critique of pure reason, explaining how we know what we know. He talked about a priori, ideas that we know prior to the experience, and then a posteriori, what we know after the experience. So Kant is really looking at the world, trying to figure out, how do we know? And if we do know it, well, then what do we really know about it? Hegel comes along. If you remember, Hegel was mentioned previously also. He looks at it and says, well, here's what we do. We look at things, we synthesize what we are observing, we come up with a view about it, what is called a thesis, and then eventually we're going to react against that, the antithesis. So you synthesize information, you form a thesis, a concept, as it says here, about a pattern, and then we react against that pattern. He says that's how human work is. That's how human nature is. That's how society progresses. We form an idea. We look at everything around us. We synthesize that information. We form an idea. And then eventually we're going to react against that idea. And that creates the movement in history. What he called the world spirit. Schopenhauer, again, notice we're covering all these philosophers who really were previously, would have been in chapter 19. So Schopenhauer comes along and says that, for the most part, people are not reasonable creatures. We don't think reasonably. We are too emotional. And as such, we're mostly wrong with what we're looking at. And we're wrong because all we want is what we want. Your book calls it people are selfish. It's because we want what we want, and we want it when we want it. And we don't care how we get it. And that science simply allows us to feel comfortable with where we are. So Kant is reacting, saying that no, we are reasonable creatures. We're capable of thought. Hegel says, well, we do think. We create ideas. We just react against those eventually. So you have all these philosophers writing. And eventually Schopenhauer's view gets, a little more to the negative, the cynical approach. But we're going to see him influence Marx and Engels. Because they're going to look and say, yeah, the world is built of selfish people. We need to change that. And that takes us to Marx. Here we go. Where he looks at the world and says this capitalistic attitude, this view has always been built around one group wanting what it wants, selfishly taking it, and not thinking about the other people, and instead exploiting those people. And so you have what he called the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, middle class and upper middle class, and nobles who have always benefited from how things have been and do not therefore want change. And the proletariats, the working class people who have had to put up with all of this. It says, no, we need to change it. This is where we need to reform the world. And so it mentions Marx in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. He didn't write it by himself. He and Engels equally shared in writing this. Now, Engels was from a family of upper middle class, or as it says here, they owned a textile factory. He actually inherited it. So he's from a fairly well-to-do class, but he reacted against it. How sometimes children want to, rebel against their parents. And this is what Engels did. He and Marx met in Paris, and they share some similar ideas. Marx was from a much lower working class kind of group of people. And so they worked together, and they wrote and produced Communist Manifesto. Now, we branded it as Marxism, but it was really an equal work among the two. Engels eventually sort of fades, and Marx becomes much more the voice. He was much more of a dominant personality, but he and Engels actually shared in the writing of the Communist Manifesto. It was equally theirs. As says here, capitalism is hostile to artistic development because it's obsessed with money and profit. This idea that's all it's about, that art's not about that. And so you wind up having his views about it. So that's why so many artists became part of the rebellion against the system. You have other aspects, this view that we need to show the world as it is, not as we want it to be, because it's not that way. And so realism starts developing during the 1840s and 50s, in America at least. It's a little earlier, actually, even in Europe. And so when the Communist Manifesto was published, 1840s into the 50s, it sort of embraced even further. But we have all these details that are offered here. Engels defined the proletariat, the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production, are reduced to under labor in order to live. And that's really a key aspect here. And you'll see here from the Communist Manifesto two very central principles and what happens. And so you have this excerpt here. And there's the call, working men of countries unite. Meanwhile, you have science being applied to the world. On the Origin of Species in the 50s is published, where Darwin has looked at the world and says, okay, let's apply science and let's look at what we have seen. And he goes off on the Beagle and goes to Galapagos, and he observes this isolated culture there of animals, the fauna and flora, plants and animals, or animals and plants, fauna and flora, and sees how they have developed on this island. And therefore he said, well, this is what we're looking at. We're seeing that this is how life has evolved. Herbert Spencer will later call it survival of the fittest. That is not Darwin's term. That is Herbert Spencer's term that's going to be applied. But what we see here is, well, he talked about correlation of growth, use and disuse, that changes occur in the conditions of life, so that whatever seems to be able to adapt to the environment will be the one to survive. And so that's what we're looking at here. And so, as it says here, individual of the same species come in all respects into the close competition with each other. The struggle will generally be the most severe between them. The slightest advantage in one being over those with which it comes in competition or bare adaptation will turn the balance. And that's what he looked at. They says, this is how civilizations occur. This is how species develop and build. It's not an inherent superiority. It's that whoever can adapt is what's going to be the ones who will evolve. As I said, this idea about survival of the fittest was a term that Herbert Spencer developed. Meanwhile, you have also other studies, Pasteur, looking at the idea about bacteria and the idea about illnesses being caused by this, the idea about food safety becoming important, sterilization of equipment, because previously they didn't do that. When they operated, they literally would just line up the patients, and a doctor would operate on one and then move to the next patient on the next table, taking the equipment they just used and use it again. The idea about, again, pasteurization, again, named after Louis Pasteur, the idea about heating up to kill bacteria and making it safer becomes important. And so we have this aspect. And as I was saying earlier about neoclassicism to romanticism, people start reacting against reason. this idea about the focus on, well, that's not reasonable. Well, that's not reasonable. Eventually, people are going to react and say, but this is how I feel. And the romantic rises out of that. And actually, in about the 1820s, we start seeing a really strong movement. It actually had occurred earlier than that, much earlier than that. In the 1750s and 60s, we start seeing some of the reaction against the science. And by the time you get to 1800, you already have these movements taking place. By 1820, it's fairly well in place, but by 1830s or 40s, it starts dying out in Europe as a dominant philosophy, but it moves to the United States and becomes really strong for about 20 years, and then it dies away as a major philosophy. It doesn't go away. Romanticism never goes away, but it builds in the 18th century, the 1700s, and eventually by the middle of the 19th century, it starts dying away as a dominant movement. Neoclassic art, we've already seen about David. He was, again, talked about previous chapter. This is his coronation of Napoleon and the coronation of Josephine. If you'll look here, this is Napoleon. You have the Pope sanctioning his coronation as emperor. He's trying to resurrect the Holy Roman Empire, sort of. He's declared emperor of France, and he is, of course, crowning his queen, his empress, Josephine. Notice he's doing it himself. Notice the attire is very much Roman. It's that Greco-Roman style. Here he's actually in sort of a toga. That's not typical attire, okay, of the era, 1800s, early 1800s. But this is that painting where David captures the neoclassic style and really presents it. You have off over on the side the statues, the carvings, the grandness of this, all this very neoclassic in that aspect. And so this is David offering this for us. We start seeing some changes though, such as Girardeau Cherson, the Entombment of Atala, based on a novel by Chateaubriand. Again, the United States was very popular in the 18th century and into the 19th century. A very popular place. It was subject of a number of books. You'd be amazed how many works were set in America. Well, a Frenchman wrote about a Native American who, they fall in love, a Native American young man and woman fall in love, but they're from different tribes. Again, think Romeo and Juliet. Okay, it really is. And this is called The Entombment of Atala. This is a painting based on that novel, where Atala, they fall in love. Atala says she can't, she's being kept from him, so she commits suicide. And so you have Choctaws comes and with assistant places her into the grave, assistance of a priest. That's who this is. And so you have, these details here. Please notice that the appearance, not quite what you would think of necessarily as the way Native Americans are often depicted. Her attire here, his view, the skin coloration, all of that. Really not. You have Christian symbolism back here. All the details here. Here you can see the French expression here. Again, lowering her into the grave as he holds her close, receiving the Christian burial. Not necessarily what we would think of as the view of how a Native American might be, but again, it's the French view of what Native American would be. A little bit classic, but also this is where that emotion comes in. That's really sort of that romantic view here. As it says here, the intimacy of the emotional suffering. And this is where romanticism starts coming in, where we start seeing more and more emotion being offered. You have others. You have David, student of Ingres. He is a little neoclassic, but he also moves into some of the other works. We start seeing, as it says here, his version was being very radical, deviant. He becomes much more leading us into Romanticism. And this is what happens. Romanticism sort of starts here in the 1700s and spreads out, and then eventually comes over to America. Baudelaire, a French poet who is a little after the Romantic, but still has some of that tendency of Romanticism, says his situation is neither in choice of subject nor in exact truth, but in a way of feeling. And that really becomes the most important aspect. This idea about emotions are prioritized, not reason. Imagination is more important than realism. Let's not try to show the world as it is. Let's allow other aspects to come through. It's going to give rise to the Gothic. It's going to give rise to the science fiction later that develops. It's going to give rise to a number of other aspects. It's going to go back to some of the Renaissance writings where you have a great deal of imagination being used, and they draw upon that. They take their subjects to express the subjective view, not an objective concept. It says here the fantastic and the exotic are going to be used. That's why what we saw earlier, the Americas were considered exotic locales to the European. Back to nature movement. And so we have all that as part of it. Here's some of the principal characteristics. Focus on feeling, especially personal feelings. Music is going to be dealing with that, where you're going to have much stronger emotions coming through. It's not going to be so much as the sequencing of the notes and the arrangement of the different parts as in the classical concert, the symphony. But you're going to have instead much more focus upon allowing the emotions of the music to be expressed. Same with poetry. You're going to have much more individual emotions being emerging in the works. Focus on, as is the fantastic and the exotic. You're going to have stories of the different works, including the musical compositions, focusing upon works such as ancient Egypt and Greece. You're going to have works based upon India, China. You're going to have the Americas. The Native Americans are going to be part of this. You're going to have nature, where everything's going to be built around nature. Beethoven and his Pastoral Symphony, the painting, the choice of subjects and paintings. You're going to have writing focus upon the individual and the individual making decisions and choices, not confined by what society or what reason says, but allowing the individual and his views and beliefs or her views and beliefs to emerge, as with Emerson and his essays. All this is part of what we see as the Romantic movement, and the focus upon political. The United States, with the Declaration of Independence that we talked about in 19, with Jefferson writing it, highly influenced by Locke, highly influenced by Rousseau, this idea of the age of reason. But it's also, it's one of these interesting documents. There's reason on trying to be used, but Jefferson is highly influenced by the emerging Romantic sentiments. When he writes about all men are created equal, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, he's trying to take that logical approach, the reasonable approach, but then he brings in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not how Locke wrote. Locke, as I think I mentioned, wrote about life, liberty, and property. Well, Jefferson brings in happiness, emotions, feelings. This idea of each individual being as good as any other individual, the individual concept, that's Romantic. And so you have in the founding of America both one foot in the neoclassic age and the age of reason, but another foot in this Romantic era that's emerging. So we're sort of a binary country, as it may be. Again, you go back to some of this classical style that this is Ingres we talked about earlier. His use of that classical style, he's been taught by David, So he takes, that classical posing and use of figures, but he brings into it this emotional concept, a strong emotion here where, again, you're supposed to be reacting emotionally. The use of the deep blues here and the coloring and the female form to elicit this emotion. This is another Delacroix as he comes along later. We'll see Delacroix emerging really highly romantic. He has some wonderful paintings. Now, Cezanne comes along later. We get to him toward the end of this subject. We're going to start seeing more of this sort of the imagistic, impressionistic work used. And then we have a much later one. This is in the 20th century, much later, Sylvia's Sleigh. And so you have these details offered in that way. So in Spain and France, we start seeing the movement away from neoclassic art into romantic. Goya capturing, this is in Spain, Goya trying to capture the strong, intense emotions and bringing in this idea of the sleep of reason produces monsters, that sort of science fiction aspect. You have the figures here, the owl, the figures that looks like bats all coming in. All these figures, sort of that what we're eventually going to call surrealism, that's going to emerge at the end of the 1800s into early 1900s. This is Goya, again, very similar to what we would call neoclassic style, but it's family of Charles V. Then you have this work, Goya capturing the massacre, the reaction against Napoleon. This is painting here about the citizens being executed by Napoleonic forces, the troops in May of 1804, I believe. And this is painted in 1808. Maybe it is 1808. Yeah, it was in 1808 where you had the uprising. And so this is painted about that, and he paints it later. In 1814. That's what I was thinking. 18. That's what 4 was in my head because I knew it was a 4. And so this is painted a few years after, where he tries to capture this view, the idea about the killing of the citizens lined up and shot. And then this is one of the more famous ones by Goya, Fight to the Death with Clubs, where again, sort of capturing this idea about the emotion, the feelings, the attitudes, all part of it. This one capturing the surrendering here of the people, and the look at the eyes as they face what is happening. That idea of the priest praying over the slain bodies. This anguish here, this emotion that's being offered. And this really helps to move that romantic sentiment and views and attitudes. Guercot captures the raft of the Medusa. This was based on a historical event where you had, again, this is a part of that, the trade situation as the ships are traveling back and forth. Well, there was a shipwreck off the coast of West Africa. And so you had individuals trying to come to France. Well, these immigrants were, ship was crippled, so they just shoved them off onto a raft. And so, of course, they were eventually, they died from this. It was very much a political scandal that erupted. Well, Guercot paints this and tries to convey this aspect of the suffering of these individuals who were just trying to get to a better place. And so you have, as it says here, the hardship, the duress, the corpse, the idea of the ones who are still alive, others who are, clearly in a situation, man waving a shirt toward a rescue ship. So we're trying to be saved, but it's just a speck off in the distance way over here. Instead, that nature doesn't care, that there is no feelings, that nature is unemotional. The nature is apathetic. That means no feelings about the plight of these people that humans are battling, and it's just sheer survival, they hope. And that's going to lead into a later view toward the middle and end of the 1900s called naturalism, and we'll get to that later. But this is Guercot, and then you have Delacroix. And again, very political, just as Guercot was. Delacroix, his apprentice comes in and also paints about the political issues. You have the Greco-Turkish War in the 1820s, where Greece was trying to fight for its freedom from what previously had been the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. You're going to have the British poet Lord Byron will go and fight in that war and actually die during that war. This focus on freedom, revolution, very much a romantic view that the individual should be free and not subject to the oppression. Very much a romantic view. And so Delacroix is painting this about the massacre at Chios, and it tells you in your book here about this idea that the Turks massacred 90% of the population of this little island, a Greek island. And so you have this view, and here you can see the Turks riding in on their horses, people being killed, women, children, men, all that taking place. And you can see sort of the rise here in the background, that very impressionistic. Delacroix is not impressionist, but it's going to help give rise to the impressionist school later. And this is what we wind up seeing. As it says here, an air of unreality as you look in the background for it. In the United Kingdom, that's England, Germany, you're also going to have some of this building. This is William Blake, who's really is a pre-romantic. He's in an era prior to really Romanticism being part of the British landscape, but he writes poetry. He does etchings. He's a printer. He does engraving. He builds a way of engraving with illustration and text called illuminated printing. Think of it as sort of a forerunner to the graphic novel, the way comic books are done along those lines, where you have both text and image printed at once. Well, he developed a way of doing that. This is a part of his views against, as we talked about in the previous chapter, against slavery. He was very much pushing for that. And this is about in other areas. This is not in England, but in Suriname, where slaves were being, if they were resistant, they were being punished. In this case, put on the gallows. Where he, being very political, says he believed in the liberty of all people, and so he uses that. Constable comes along. This is part of the romantic view. Paint nature, paint the landscape as the dominant subject, and man just being sort of a minor part of it. The peaceful rustic scene, the way the house, if you'll notice here, nature growing up and around the house, so that the house, a construction by man, is actually fitting into nature rather than trying to take over nature. And so this is very much a painting of Constable, and we're going to see it also. This is called the hay wagon, in case you don't know what that one is. The hay wain, wain is just another word for wagon. Turner comes along, and he also sort of is a herald to a forerunner to what we see as impressionistic art. Turner is a contemporary of Constable. He is also using political subjects. This is called the slave ship. As you can see, it's sort of out. Here's the ship itself, but you see how it's jettisoning of people. Trying to save it, themselves from the storm, and you have the drowning of individuals. You make out, and you see that again, the harsh colorings that are used, the fierceness of nature being presented in this case. Talks about the details of drowning figure in the lower right. That's what all that is. The mystery of the universe. This idea that the world is not sympathetic to nature, is sympathetic to man. Nature instead is simply nature. And man has to deal with that. This is one of the more famous of the romantic artist works. This is called Wanderer. Sometimes Wanderer says above a sea of mist, but you'll see this painting quite often used to talk about romanticism. This individual, who is clearly in his mountain climbing attire, has come up to the top of a mountain, is looking out over nature, where man fits in or doesn't fit in. That nature is misted for him. The man is only able to observe so much. We don't see the face of the wanderer. That's not what is important. Instead, we have everything else around it. That man is just simply part of it. This is what it calls here. He has ascended to the summit. He is seeing the world. There's a sort of a sublime experience, your book calls it, as man looks out over the world. That's Friedrich. He paints a number of other works, really beautiful work. And unfortunately, I'll give you one example of his in this, but he's a very prominent German painter of this era. Literature comes along too. Goethe, writing at the end of the 18th century and early part of the 19th, publishes a work called Faust. He goes back to the old story that had been around for centuries. In the 16th century, in the late 16th century, you had Christopher Marlowe in England write about Dr. Faustus, a play. Well, Goethe comes in. Yes, the name is pronounced Goethe, sort of an R sound. He writes a poetic form of the story, Faust, in which a man sells his soul for the sake of knowledge, reason, and what he suffers from there. And he writes a very extended work about this one, The Pact with the Devil. And in his version, Mephistopheles bets with God, and they can lure Faust away by offering him knowledge and worldly pleasures. And Faust takes advantage of Marguerite, who's called Gretchen in the book. He seduces her, then abandons her, and she goes crazy. She gives birth to a child, though, and she's eventually executed. It's one of these real harsh aspects about this. And so you have Gretchen asking Faust about his view about God. Does he believe in God? And you have this response. As says here, it is romantic, and they answer that the divine is found in the beauty of the everlasting stars. And that's what he says, in the feeling when thou utterest art blessed, then call it what thou wilt. Call it bliss, heart, love, God. I have no name for it. 'Tis feeling all. Name is but sound as smoke in clouding heaven's glow. And so he writes this view, and sort of ends sort of darkly when you read Faust Part 1. Well, several years later, he writes Part 2, which he tries to, shall we say, resurrect Western civilization. Faust eventually is able to be with Helena of Troy, and together they're able to bring about the rise of civilization. It's part of what we wind up seeing. Faust is redeemed by the divine love of Gretchen. He is redeemed, if you will. In that he's able to benefit and be saved, if you will. That Marguerite, Gretchen, sort of like Dante and his Beatrice, who sins to save him. Faust is saved as well. Very romantic in that way. You have the development in England. They talk about Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. When we talk about the Romantic movement in England, we generally link it to the publication of a collection of poems called Lyrical Ballads, first published in 1798, authored by William Wordsworth and his friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The plan had been for them to share in it equally, but Coleridge was ill. He suffered from several problems and illnesses, and so he was only able to contribute a couple of works to it. They're important works, but one of them being the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, very long work. Bulk of it is Wordsworth, and so Wordsworth is considered the father of Romanticism in England, and they influence other poets. Unfortunately, what happens is the ones who follow them immediately Poets such as Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, as I mentioned earlier, and then John Keats, they all die early. Keats, who's the youngest of those three, dies first. He suffers from tuberculosis and dies when he's 26. You have Percy Bysshe Shelley dying when he's 29. He drowns. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to have Lord Byron. His name was George Gordon, but he has a title, Lord Byron, so he's called Byron. Byron dies during the Greco-Turkish War. And so he's in his mid-30s. So by the time you get to what should have been the new generation of romantics fostering the movement and building it, well, those who would have been the leaders of that second generation to keep it going, they've all died away. And Wordsworth gets older, gets a little darker in his views as he looks at the world around him. And so you don't have the romantic movement lasting in England terribly long. But he writes about lyrical ballads. You can see the little intro here. So it was peak in the history of English literature, several themes: love of nature, views of independence, the individual. You have some looking at the darker side, and it names Shelley, George Gordon, known as Byron, and John Keats, the ones I was just talking about. Now, Blake, as I mentioned earlier, is a pre-romantic. He sort of captures some of those same ideas, but his work, although written earlier and published, really didn't receive much attention. His work's going to be studied much later. He sort of looked at the world in a dichotomy. He says there's one side and the other. There's innocence and experience. It says innocence is looking at the world in this positive, happy, what we would consider romantic vein. And then experience looks at it a little darker, that there's something else in the world. And so you have the two sides that actually will be presented in Wordsworth, where he has his more positive works and then later his darker views. And so you have these in every, he publishes songs of innocence, Blake does, and then he publishes songs of experience. And they're always balanced, where you have a positive, an innocence poem, and then you have its mate in songs of experience. In the case of songs of innocence, you have the lamb, and it's mirrored by the tiger. Sometimes they'll have the same title, though, and where you have two different views on the same situation. Blake is a strong writer, much better than people give him credit for sometimes. But again, he also did this with his illuminated printing, where he illustrated. He used archaic writing because, again, the Romantics want to go back to a different era. So he uses archaic. That's why it's spelled with a Y here. And he does his illustrations go with it. And present it in that way. Wordsworth, as I noted, was a father of Romanticism. He has a lengthy poem called Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. The whole poem is best known just as Tintern Abbey, where he goes off and, again, there actually was an abandoned monastery, an abbey, and it was overgrown. And Wordsworth, in his travels, seeing this, had seen this, been there looking at it, and he writes about it. Now, this is the painting by J.M.W. Turner. And again, this is actually done before the poem. He had seen the assumption is that Wordsworth was familiar with both the painting here, but he also had visited the site. And so you can see this romantic view, the abbey being overgrown by nature and sort of fitting into nature itself. And you have some lines here from it. This is in lyrical ballads. You have a number of poems that are all put together. And this is one of them. It's called My Heart Leaps Up. Again, just that's the first line of the poem. It's all sort of fit together into one major work. And he says, the child is father of the man. One of those interesting lines. This idea that what we are as children will give birth to how we will be as adults. If you want to go with that interpretation of the line, that's part of how we see this. And that he longs to retain that innocence of childhood, to retain it, carry it with him, even as we go through the world. Well, Blake had talked about innocence and experience. He says, the way the world is, you have to be experienced. You have to be a little cynical. You have to recognize there are darker aspects. Otherwise, you'll be eaten alive, i.e. the tiger. Well, Wordsworth says, we need to try to cling to that innocence if we can, that what we are as children will give rise to how we are as adults, but we don't want to lose that we want to maintain it, as he calls it, the natural piety. That when we see a rainbow, we should still experience that joy we had as children, that glow about the mystery of the rainbow. Rather than trying to explain it as merely the refraction of light as it goes through the droplets still and creating the refraction of light into its separate colors. No, let's keep the joy of seeing the colors and reveling in the beauty rather than trying to explain it away and becoming cynical about it, losing that joy of childhood. And that's really what we see. Well, eventually, Wordsworth himself gets overwhelmed by the world and how dark it becomes. Coleridge, as I said, writes the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, close friends with Wordsworth. His health deteriorates. He writes a number of really strong poems. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is one where, again, capturing this idea, the view about the beauty of nature and the concepts, but allowing the world to sometimes overwhelm us. You can read the little parts here. I'm not going to do that. This idea that one of the messages of the poem, appreciate all of God's creatures, nature, the killing of the albatross by the mariner brings about a curse, because wearing an albatross around one's neck, the idea about a curse of some sort of penance, that mankind is powerless in the face of nature itself. Meanwhile, you have Byron, one of these major writers. He is highly influenced by the movements of the French Revolution and later, this idea of being free as an individual. This idea about liberty is most important, that we should not be constrained by what society says we can and cannot do. Byron was sort of passionate figure. He was, it says here, born with a lame foot, a club foot. He was still an outstanding athlete, a boxer, a swimmer. He was a man who did not necessarily conform to society, fell in love with, had a number of affairs, including with a married woman, Lady Caroline Lamb, who called him mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He becomes the, it's now called the Byronic hero. He writes about Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, his first work, in which, when it was published in 1813, he awoke to find himself famous and became sort of the bad boy of English society, and people wanted to be like him, and all the women wanted to be with him, and everybody emulated him, and tried to do all this, and eventually he becomes ostracized by society when he creates a number of scandals. And he writes a number of poems, including, as I said, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. He writes Don Juan. You have to say it as two syllables. John is Don Juan, but Juan, because he wants two syllables for the sake of the rhythm. He writes a number of other poems, very popular, and then he fades. He loses it very quickly because of the scandals. And society decides they can't have that many scandals. But he's just a wonderful worker in the language. Childe Harold becomes sort of the embodiment of the Byronic hero, Don Juan, capturing even further this idea about the individual who's dark and brooding, and doesn't play by the rules of society because he can't be constrained by what society says. He is free to be the individual, the romantic view. Shelley is very much in that same line. He goes to Oxford. He's from a fairly well-to-do family, goes to Oxford, gets expelled from Oxford when he publishes, along with a friend, a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism, that we can't be told what to believe. If you ever read the full aspect of it, it's not so much that he says that there is no God. He says you can't be told there's God. You need to discover it for yourself. So you have to be atheistic, and then you can eventually find your way to God. If to belief on your own, you can't just accept it because other people have told you so. You need to find it on your own. He gets expelled. He marries a young woman named Harriet. They have a child, but then he finds another person he prefers, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote on the Vindication of the Rights of Women, and the other social philosopher, William Godwin. They had married. Mary Wollstonecraft dies in childbirth. And so William Godwin's daughter and Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter is named Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. They meet, they fall in love, and as Shelley felt, he should not be restrained by society. Just because he's married to somebody else doesn't mean he can't love someone else and leave his first wife. Society can't tell me what to do. So that's what happens. He abandons his first wife and child, and they run off. That creates a scandal. And so they leave England and go off to the French continent. They go off with Byron. They meet up with Byron. They become good friends. They travel throughout Europe. And he's writing his poetry, getting it published. They are together in a number of different ways and places. Another little coterie of people who have the same views and feelings. And 1818, actually a little before that, they're in Switzerland. I believe it's Switzerland. Anyway, they're in the Alps, in the mountains. It's wintertime. They're sort of kept from being able to go off and do much. So they tell stories. And Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley, because they do eventually get married, Percy's first wife dies, probably suicide. And so she tells a story that everybody's so impressed with that they tell her she should publish it. And so in 1818, she publishes a story focused upon this scientist who believes he can create life, he can be God. And so he gets this, parts of a cadaver, puts it all together, and using science, energy, lightning, because the electricity, he zaps this body and it comes to life, and he has created life, man being God. And she shows the consequence of this, because things do not work out happily when man tries to be God. Take science and push it to the extreme. This is, bad things happen, that man can't rely on science totally. And so this work is called Frankenstein. And so Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein. Meanwhile, Percy Bysshe Shelley, the greater of the writers, publishes a number of poems which are strong, and some of them brood. But there's a melancholy air about many of the works, where he looks at the world and says, this is what happens. When Keats dies, Shelley writes Adonais, a lament about the loss of Keats. Now, John Keats, who's mentioned here, as I say, he's the youngest of these three, Byron, Shelley, and Keats, but he dies first. He also looks at the world in which he thinks about the individual, the idea about the feelings, allowing the emotions, but he also sees it in sort of a melancholy way, that life is a struggle, that happiness is not always guaranteed. He's seen a number of his siblings die. His father was literally a keeper of stables in London. And Keats is at a young age apprenticed to an apothecary with the hope that he might eventually become a surgeon. But when he's 19, he abandons that and wants to devote himself to writing poetry. By the time he's 23 or so, He himself has been diagnosed with tuberculosis after seeing several of his siblings already die from it. By the time he's 24 or so, he's not able to write much. He goes off to Italy to take a treatment for his tuberculosis and eventually dies at a young age, usually 20. He's barely 26. He dies in 1821. Beautiful poetry, wonderful writing. They give you a quote from Ode to a Nightingale here. You can see this. You have to raise it up, though, so to really see the whole poem. So it makes it really difficult to read here. But he writes about this. The idea about meditation on the nature of human experience in the world. And he writes about this and says he dies before his 26th birthday. He's around 26 when he dies. You also had during this time, though, the development of the novel. Now, previously, we've talked about Cervantes writing Don Quixote, the picaresque, but the English novel comes along in the 1700s. You have a writer, Samuel Richardson, who publishes a novel, an extended work of fiction. It's called a novel because it's new. It's a new form of writing, hence novel. It really wasn't, but he said it was. And he wrote a series of, it's called the epistolatory novel, a series of letters from a young woman back home. Her name was Pamela. She was a servant. She left the country to go to work at a large manor, estate owned by a nobleman. And she's writing about what happens to her. So she's a series of letters back home saying that the nobleman keeps trying to capture her and seduce her. And she keeps saying no. He captures her, sort of confronts her in the hallways, confronts her on the stairwells, and she keep telling him, no, I cannot give in. I'm a good girl. And eventually, the last of the novel, the nobleman has proposed to her, and she writes that she and the nobleman are getting married. And so, Virtue Reward is the subtitle of the book. That's the first novel in the English language, 1740. Except it really wasn't. A man named Daniel Defoe, who was a journalist, who was always in debt, had written a work, travel logs and adventures in the New World were always, and around the world, as people were saying, they were very popular in the early 18th century. So he'd written a work called Robinson Crusoe, as we know it, in which he talked about this man who had been a sailor, who'd been shipwrecked on an island, but been there for 19 years and been there a long time, and then had written about his experience, that he'd told the story to Defoe, did not want to have his real name revealed, and so Defoe had gotten it published. His publishers had been assured that it was based on a real story, just didn't want to tell the guy's name, so it was published. He also published a couple of years later another work called Moll Flanders, The Lifetimes of Moll Flanders, about a young woman who had risen from, sort of the lower ranks to become a noble woman, and all of the adventures she'd had. Again, not using the real name, he'd assured, so he had it published as an autobiography type work, a biographical aspect, a young woman telling her story. Well, when Richardson publishes Pamela saying that, no, I'm making all this up, and he was hailed for creating this new novel form of writing. Well, Defoe was still alive, so well, no, wait a minute, I did that 20 years ago. Robinson Crusoe, I made it all up. Moll Flanders, I made it all up. Well, that didn't sit too well with the publisher. You told us it was real. He goes, I lied. And not only did I lie about that, but remember my, the diaries I found in the attic about the plague years, Journal of the Plague Years that I had, told you I found it as a diary written up in an attic of a house I rented. They went, yeah. He goes, no, I lied about that too. I made all that up. And so Defoe probably published the first novel in the English language in 1719. But the first novel in the English language is generally attributed to Samuel Richardson. And that sort of gives rise to this idea of the romantic novel, because with Pamela, again, she winds up, the nobleman falls in love with her and they get married. You have a number of other writers who sort of satirize that idea. But by the time you get to the late 1790s, you have other people writing about couples and people and society. And among those, Jane Austen. In 1811, she publishes her first novel called Sense and Sensibility. Now, Northanger Abbey is listed here first. It's not published till later. But Sense and Sensibility is her first published work. She had written Northanger Abbey as sort of a parody of the Gothic novels that were so popular during that time. But she doesn't get it published till later. But Sense and Sensibility, and then Pride and Prejudice a little bit later. They put 11 or 12. Actually, it was published in 1813. In a series of novels, you'll see that they list the 6 of them here. She offers a view about society. Again, generally her works, finish off happily. Everybody gets matched up the ways they should be. But along the way, she offers a number of comments about society. It's highly satiric at times. It's very much looking at the world around her and what's expected. And she sort of, puts a shaft right through it. The opening of Pride and Prejudice is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. That, again, sort of skewering how society looks at it. And so, again, really, really effective. And she's just a brilliant writer. Just, really strong. And you have comments from her in some of her personal writings, letters. And that's what this is taken from, Plan of a Novel, where it talks about, here's what you got to do. Okay. That here's what they expect. That the heroine, the daughter of a clergyman, that he's settled with a very small fortune. He doesn't have much. He, the most excellent man, could be perfect in character, delightful companion to his daughter. The heroine is a faultless character, perfectly good, quick-witted. That she, that music, she can do all these, that she's quite beautiful to look at. These are the details respected from the young woman. And then the man who's going to capture her attention, eventually be her perfect mate, will be a man of certain qualities. Now, this is what I was telling you about Mary Shelley. They're in Geneva, Switzerland. She eventually publishes Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. In which, of course, she looks at the world and says, this is what science leads us to. It's not as happy as we would think. And it's published, as I said, in 1818. She has a number of other novels as well, quite a number of other works that she does. She really, writes more than just this one, but this is really the one work, Frankenstein, is what she's known for. She does publish other works. She actually publishes one that writes about a world in which a pandemic pushes through the world and people die at record numbers until only very few people are left, and they try to isolate themselves so that they can avoid becoming exposed to this virus that moves through the world in a devastating fashion. Interesting. I'm sure we're not familiar with anything like that. Meanwhile, in France, you also have the writer. He's much more romantic. You have Victor Hugo writing in the 1800s. You have works such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame. You have Les Miserables, where he's looking at a situation that occurred earlier. He writes a book in the 60s. 62 is what your book calls it, publication. But he's looking at an episode that occurred much earlier, the Student Revolution in the 30s, where they were pushing against the government. It doesn't quite work out, but you have a famous scene in the novel. And you have, of course, a very simple storyline. Jean Valjean, who tries to save his family from starvation. He steals a loaf of bread. He is condemned to prison for that, because he hears about the suffering of his sister and her children. He tries to break out different times, go help them, so he gets added years. He eventually is paroled, but he's supposed to follow his parole, but eventually he breaks his parole. He doesn't report in as he's supposed to, creates a new identity for himself. And again, that's the basic of Les Miserables. In case you're wondering, it, as it says here, has become one of the most popular musicals in all of history. Meanwhile, we have musical stories coming along as well. Romantic music develops. You have composers, and I'm over time now. So let's go ahead and stop this now, and we'll pick up with this later. We luckily have the rest of this week to cover 20. I'm also probably going to try to cover a little bit of 21. We'll try to start it next week as well. So again, a reminder, if you have not taken the exam yet, it's still open, still available through Wednesday. If you have an issue trying to get into it, let me know, and I'll try to get that problem rectified. So I will see you guys on Wednesday.